A story of power, trade, and silent battle. The sun rose slowly over the land between two rivers. Golden light spilled across fields of barley, glimmered on mud-brick cities, and reflected from the calm waters of the Euphrates. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. Farmers were already awake, merchants prepared their carts, priests whispered prayers to ancient gods. But beneath this calm surface, something dangerous was unfolding. There would be no armies marching today, no swords clashing, no cities burning in flames. And yet this would become one of the most powerful wars humanity had ever seen. A war not fought with blood, but with grain, not with weapons, but with trade routes, not with soldiers, but with taxes, tariffs, and control. This was the world around 1500 BC, and this was the beginning of the first economic war in history. Long before money existed as coins, before banks, before stock markets, before Wall Street, civilizations were already fighting over one thing above all else: resources. Grain fed armies, copper made weapons, tin created bronze, wood built ships, and control over trade routes meant control over life itself. In this ancient world, power did not come from how many soldiers you had. Power came from what you controlled. And two great civilizations stood at the center of this silent battle: Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mesopotamia was not a single kingdom. It was a crowded land of city-states: Babylon, Assyria, Mari, each fighting to survive between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These rivers were unpredictable. Floods could destroy harvests overnight. Droughts could starve cities into submission. So Mesopotamians learned something early. You cannot depend only on nature. You must control trade. They built vast trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. Caravans carried grain, wool, silver, and copper across deserts and mountains. Merchants became as powerful as generals. Records were carved into clay tablets. Debts were tracked. Taxes were enforced. In Mesopotamia, economics was law, and law was power. Far to the west, Egypt lived under a very different reality. The Nile River flooded like clockwork. Every year, it deposited rich black soil that made the land incredibly fertile. Crops grew easily. Food was abundant. Famine was rare. Egypt did not need to chase resources. Resources came to Egypt. Gold flowed from Nubia. Grain filled massive storage houses. Pharaohs ruled like gods, their power supported by surplus. Egypt was rich, and everyone knew it. Between these two worlds lay the most valuable thing of the ancient age: trade routes. Paths carved by footsteps and wagon wheels, stretching from Anatolia to the Levant, from Mesopotamia to the Nile. Whoever controlled these routes controlled the flow of wealth. And around 1500 BC, those routes became contested. Not with armies, but with rules. It started quietly. A Mesopotamian city-state raised tariffs on foreign merchants. Egyptian traders suddenly found themselves paying more to pass through land they had used freely for generations. At first, Egypt complained politely. Envoys were sent. Clay tablets were exchanged. Words like fair trade and mutual benefit were carved carefully into diplomatic letters. But behind the scenes, something darker was happening. Mesopotamian rulers realized something crucial. Egypt did not need war to be weakened. Egypt needed trade. So they began to restrict it. Grain shipments slowed. Copper deliveries were delayed. Caravans were lost in the desert. Warehouses were closed for inspection. Nothing illegal, nothing openly hostile, just enough disruption to create pressure. In Egyptian cities, priests noticed something strange. Grain reserves were still full, but prices were rising. Gold was abundant, but fewer goods were available to buy. The economy was tightening, and no one could point to a battlefield where it was happening. Egypt responded in kind. They didn't send soldiers east, they sent ships south. The Nile River connected Egypt to Africa. Gold mines in Nubia became more important than ever. Egypt expanded control over southern routes, cutting Mesopotamian traders out of African resources. Suddenly, Mesopotamian bronze makers faced shortages. Without tin and copper, weapons production slowed. Tools became scarce, prices rose, workers were paid less. The pressure was spreading. This was no longer trade tension, this was economic warfare. What made this war different was its invisibility. Farmers still worked their fields. Cities still held festivals. Kings still claimed divine favor. But beneath it all, entire economies were being choked. Merchants went bankrupt. Debt slavery increased. City-states collapsed, not from invasion, but from inflation and scarcity. For the first time in history, power was being exercised without physical violence. And it worked. One clay tablet discovered centuries later tells a chilling story. A Mesopotamian ruler writes to an ally, "The grain does not arrive. The people grow restless. Lower the price, or we will seek another path." Another tablet from Egypt reads, "Let the caravans wait. Hunger teaches obedience better than steel." These were not kings talking like warriors. They were talking like economists. As years passed, the balance of power shifted. Some Mesopotamian cities adapted. They diversified trade. They opened new routes north through Anatolia. Others failed. Egypt tightened its grip on the Nile and southern gold. Both civilizations learned a lesson that would echo through history. If you control resources, you control people. If you control trade, you control nations. This economic war did not end with a treaty. There was no single moment where someone declared victory. Instead, it faded slowly, like a disease that becomes chronic. Trade patterns changed permanently. New alliances formed, old cities declined, and future rulers took notes. Centuries later, empires would use the same tactics. Rome would starve enemies through grain control. China would dominate silk routes. European powers would weaponize trade during colonialism. Modern nations would impose sanctions instead of sending troops. But it all began here, around 1500 BC, when humanity discovered that you could destroy a rival without ever drawing a sword. The first economic war taught the world something terrifying, that wars do not always look like wars, that suffering can be caused silently, that power does not need violence to be deadly. And in many ways, we are still fighting that same war today, just with different names, different currencies, different borders, but the same rules.